On June 4th, 2024, The Acolyte premiered on Disney+, furthering a divide among Star Wars fans that has arguably existed within the fandom since the release of 1983's Return of the Jedi, a contemporaneously beloved film which was largely considered to be the worst theatrical Star Wars film for the first 16 years of its existence. The worst of this series, that is, up until the evening of May 19th, 1999, when, with the release of The Phantom Menace, apparent Star Wars diehards threw their lightsabers to the ground and declared Star Wars dead. Of course, the majority of these fans would come back to the theaters just a few years later to check out Attack of the Clones, if only to declare Star Wars even deader. And so began a vicious cycle that would ultimately prove to be generational with the divided response to The Last Jedi in 2017. But that's another topic. For now, the point is this: the Star Wars fandom is bugging. And while the negative voices seem louder than ever, for the most part, this sort of derision is nothing really new. Upon watching the first few episodes of The Acolyte, I found myself struggling to find what people thought to be so egregiously bad about this show compared to some of the other shows Disney Star Wars has been churning out as of late. Of course, there have been bright spots, Mando Season 1 and Andor as a whole being chief among them, but for many TV watchers, the majority of the Disney era of Star Wars television has come off as meandering and unfocused, with convoluted yet occasionally boring narratives and action sequences seeming to be obviously confined to the notorious volume soundstage. Still, outside of Book of Boba Fett, which for my own taste was especially unenjoyable, there's very little that is particularly awful or offensive to me about the Star Wars television released under the Disney regime. And I've been able to have some fun with it, because as Kanan Jarrus himself once put it,
"Look, dog, you're just mad the franchise isn't aging with you."
Now, while I'm not saying I completely co-sign Kanan's sentiment here, the ability to hold on to a cross-generational fandom across mediums while placing a focus on maintaining the interest of the kid audience of Star Wars is nothing new to the execs in charge of distributing Star Wars media. Of course, there was the notorious Star Wars Holiday Special in 1978, which, despite its baffling execution, also featured the first on-screen appearance of Boba Fett, but there were also a pair of feature-length Ewok movies co-written by Lucas himself, who received story credit on both films. These aired on the Disney-owned television station, ABC, in the mid-80s. As both a Star Wars completist and a minor obsessive, I've seen these middling movies a small handful of times. Upon enduring them, it should be clear to any viewer that these are Star Wars properties made almost exclusively for the young fans. For a time, they were able to stand on their own, without too much protest from the adults in the Star Wars fandom, not only because of the obviousness of their intended audience, but also because of the films themselves sticking to a pretty clear cinematic vision. Ewok movies are broad, sword and sorcery-like fantasy films, sharing more in common both narratively and aesthetically with the Rankin Bass adaptation of The Hobbit than the first Star Wars film. At the risk of beating an obviously dead horse, it feels necessary to mention that George Lucas himself was inspired by two main cinematic sources while developing the first Star Wars film. Lucas took from the space-set film serials of his youth, such as Flash Gordon and Buck Rogers, and the samurai films of the acclaimed filmmaker Akira Kurosawa, of whom Lucas was a huge fan. Ultimately, with the first two Star Wars films, Lucas was able to create cross-appeal with movie fans at the time by presenting them with a mashup of two popular film genres, establishing a never-before-seen kind of movie, the space samurai movie. Of course, it was much more than that. I mean, Lucas basically invented the concept of a cinematic universe, but for all intents and purposes, the space samurai concept is what is at the core of the original film, a fresh and novel concept heightened by Lucas's exceptional ability to world build. Still, for audiences of the time, the movie itself was clearly identifiable as a mashup of the space adventure and samurai film genres. When trying to dive into what exactly put off the fans of the original two Star Wars films as they sat through Return of the Jedi, it's easy to cite the inclusion of that furry tribe of cute and obviously toy-friendly fantastical Ewoks as being the primary factor behind the slightly less enthusiastic response to the film compared to the first two. While it's understandable that many fans were put off by the presence of the Ewoks in Jedi, there were a number of detractors who seemed to criticize the film a bit unreasonably, unable to identify why the Ewoks were even included in the film to begin with. It seems the issue which began rearing its head ever so slightly among the fandom back then is the one that's currently tearing through the fandom now as The Acolyte airs. This is the issue of media literacy. According to the Oxford Dictionary, media literacy is the ability to critically analyze stories presented in the mass media and to determine their accuracy or credibility. In fiction, it is perhaps more recognized as the ability to recognize the themes, cultural significance, marketability, and most relevantly to this discussion, the genre of the media being consumed. There is certainly a faction of the fandom who would argue that their media literacy is strong because they are able to identify and comment on things such as the increase of female-led material in Star Wars in a time when the head of Lucasfilm is also girl. And, good on them, I guess, but what I feel is either being seriously missed or willfully ignored by a large portion of the fandom at the moment is genre and audience. Recently, I was listening to a pop culture podcast I've been a casual fan of for going on 10 years, and when reviewing The Acolyte, the host was critical of the series in ways I wasn't necessarily expecting. Specifically, the host questioned the narrative decision-making of the series in regards to the withholding of certain plot-related information 5 episodes into the series. I was surprised by this, not only because I regard this commentator fairly highly, but because, to me, the reasons behind some of the narrative choices he was referring to seemed fairly obvious. The Acolyte is very clearly a murder mystery slasher show aimed at a primarily teen audience, and it happens to be set in the Star Wars universe. Sure, we haven't seen what exactly went down with the Jedi and those Thread Witches, and we don't yet understand why May carries such a violent vendetta, and of course, we don't know who the secret Sith is because the Sith character is a literal slasher villain with big scary teeth on his mask. And look, potential spoiler here, I'm willing to bet Osha is this narrative's final girl. In Scream, the audience doesn't find out who Ghostface is or what his motivations might be until the end of the movie, with the twist reveal of dual killers, because that's how these types of stories work. In the first Friday the 13th, the tragic backstory behind Mrs. Voorhees' murdering spree is paced similarly. Of course, the rules that inform the structure of a slasher story's beats are malleable in their own way. In A Nightmare on Elm Street, we know who Freddy is as an entity pretty early on, but we lack the context for why he's attacking the teens of Elm Street and who he was in life until the end of the second act. In I Know What You Did Last Summer, starring our boy Kanan, of course, we are aware of why the teens are being preyed upon. I mean, it's in the title, but we don't know who is behind the killings themselves until we reach the payoff. I could go on and on, but the point is, slight subversions to the formula are common in these stories. Ultimately, the pieces that make up a slasher story are all there in The Acolyte. Being aware of these story beats and being able to identify the genre of the material being presented as well as the material's intended audience is basic media literacy. This isn't all to say that you have to be a fan of this kind of storytelling. I mean, you can literally just say you don't think these kinds of stories belong in this universe, but the fact that few people are even connecting these dots is kind of baffling to me. I mean, the teaser poster for this series was literally a lightsaber with a slash of blood above it, and most of the early marketing focused on the presence of star Amanda Stenberg, known for her role in The Hunger Games, who recently led another slasher project with last year's Bodies, Bodies, Bodies. For the most part, The Acolyte has sold itself as the show that it seems to be. So if it didn't seem like it'd be for you, why watch it? The fandom of Star Wars lies under an incredibly wide umbrella. You have those diehards who love the universe and will base level enjoy pretty much anything under the IP. You have the generational fans who share in the love of the series as a family, and the cinephiles who appreciate the series more than they actually like it, the science fantasy fans more into the lore than the filmmaking, and so on and so forth. But the type of fans who have both fascinated and frustrated me in equal measure are the self-flagellating ones. These are the kind of fans who seem to have really liked a couple of movies back in the 80s, but insist upon keeping up with a universe they haven't really enjoyed since 1983. I mean, if you're really thinking, hey, 2 out of 9 ain't bad, you must be a glutton for punishment, right? Or maybe you're a member of the fandom who doesn't really watch that many movies. Maybe you just have other interests. Maybe you don't go to see the latest war epic because you'd rather watch a football game at home. You don't check out the latest Netflix hit because you'd rather spend that time on a hobby like woodwork or fishing or doll collecting or whatever. That's okay. But maybe you shouldn't care so much. Maybe you can hold on to the memory of really loving that experience you had watching something with family or friends a long time ago in a movie theater far, far away and be comforted by that memory. Maybe it's time to let go just a little. Now, those of us who are longtime avid TV watchers and moviegoers should have a decent grasp of our own personal taste. We all enjoy different kinds of stories. Some of us love westerns, some mob stories or rom-coms. Some of us love space adventures, some love samurai stories, and some just love Star Wars, which is also okay. Still, we as an audience are not required to enjoy all types of stories. Despite being somewhat of a completist in the past, upon seeing the ad campaign for that Young Jedi Adventures last year, I caught on pretty quick to the idea that it was unlikely to be a show I would enjoy all that much. So I've mostly skipped out on it, and that's okay. Ultimately, just because a show or a movie has lightsabers in it, it doesn't guarantee it'll be for you, and really, it's fine. I do not think The Acolyte is a perfect show. In fact, far from it. But where have these perfect Star Wars shows been? Many fans seem to have been more easily distracted by the nostalgia of the other shows featuring legacy characters and have been unable to identify the fact that many of the same problems being cited in The Acolyte are the same problems present in most of the other Disney Star Wars series. But hey, when it's fun, it's really fun, and for a show of its kind, The Acolyte does contain some interesting characters, some narrative choices which have yet to be seen in this particular universe, and I mean, Master Soul's pretty badass, come on. Look, like most fans, I have a lot more I could say about the state of Star Wars, and I certainly have my own preferences when it comes to the types of Star Wars stories I enjoy consuming. But for now, I think I've said most of what I need to say about The Acolyte without getting too political about it. All this being said, the next time you want to get unreasonably angry on the internet about how bad Star Wars as a whole is now just because the latest episode of The Acolyte didn't match up to the canon present in a 1999 promotional tie-in magazine, try and remember.
That ain't how it works.
I'm Lil Baby Haiti. I like Star Wars. You should try to too. Bye-bye.